Welcome to the second show here on Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. I'm DP Lyle, or Doug, and I'll be discussing a few other things today about the crime fiction and the real world of criminal science. Last time we talked about murder motives and the different reasons that people kill each other. Now we're going to get into a two-part talk about some of the nuts and bolts of what the coroner or medical examiner does when faced with a unexplained, unexpected, or suspicious death. The medical examiner has to make three very important determinations. That's the cause of death, the manner of death, and the time of death. And each one of these is critical in any criminal investigation. Today is kind of part one. We're going to talk about the cause and manner of death. Death was not always easy to come up with. So if you write historical fiction, it was not known exactly how to determine when someone was dead. Just because they looked dead didn't mean they were. We know that now. We see people who are in shock or under the influence of certain drugs um, who appear dead. They're cold to the touch. Their breathing is so shallow. Their blood pressure is so low and their heart slow so that their pulse is sometimes not obtainable with your fingers, feeling in the neck or the groin or wherever on the wrist. And so consequently, people may look dead when they're not. And back in the old days, this was very difficult to do, and they came up with all kinds of methods for determining this, from pinching nipples to putting hot pokers in the rectum. A lot of very unpleasant stuff. But they had to prove that the person was dead before they buried them, and even then, they didn't get it right all the time. They actually developed a system called the Vitae Dubai asylums, or waiting mortuaries. And what they would do is they would put the person in this place, kind of out of the house in another structure, and wait for them to start smelling bad. When someone started decaying, it was a pretty good uh, test that they were dead. Um, then later on, Wilhelm Einthoven developed the um, electrocardiogram, and in fact, he won the Nobel Prize in 1924 for that. And so now you could see the electrical activity of the heart, and when that disappeared, then death could be there. And even before that, in the early 1800s, Laennec invented the stethoscope. Prior to that, physicians had to lay their ear against the patient's chest to hear the heart, but Laennec invented the stethoscope, so they could listen for the heartbeat. So it was difficult back then. Way later on, the EEG, or electroencephalogram, was invented, and that allowed us to look at brain waves to determine whether if there was any brain activity or if the brain was alive or dead or whatever. But suffice it to say, now in modern times, we can usually tell when someone's dead. So that will often bring in the coroner or medical examiner to determine what is going on. Now, he has to look at, as I said, the cause and manner of death, but there's also the mechanism of death. And we need to talk about that just briefly. The cause of death is why someone died. It can be a heart attack or a stroke or a gunshot wound or blunt force trauma with a brain injury or a disease or bleeding to death. There can be a lot of causes for someone to die. The mechanism of death is the physiologic derangement inside the body that actually led to death. Now, as physicians, we deal with this all the time. So let's say an individual has a heart attack, what we call a myocardial infarction, or MI. And what happens in that is an artery plugs from a cracked plaque, blood clot, that kind of thing, in one of the arteries that supply blood to the heart muscle, the coronary arteries. The muscle downstream from that now does not get blood supply, and it dies fairly quickly. This is called a myocardial infarction. Myocardial meaning heart muscle, and infarction meaning death due to lack of blood supply. So we call them MIs for short. That's what happens in a heart attack. Well, okay, but how does the individual die from that? It's usually a cardiac arrest. So we would write on the death certificate, cardiac arrest due to ventricular fibrillation, due to myocardial infarction, due to coronary artery disease. And that kind of covers the cause and the mechanism of death. All right, as I said, the mechanism is the physiologic derangement. So one cause can have several mechanisms. I just talked about an MI. An MI can kill you through an arrhythmia, which is just what I talked about, which leads to a cardiac arrest. But it can also cause what we call cardiogenic shock, which is when the heart muscle is so damaged it can no longer pump the blood forward in the body, and the blood pressure drops and the person dies. It can also result in a rupture of the heart. When this muscle is damaged, it becomes weak and thin and can rupture. Not a common event, but I've seen it many, many times in my career. So one cause of myocardial infarction can lead to multiple mechanisms of death. A gunshot wound is another example. If it hits the heart or the brain, then it would damage the heart or the brain in such a way that was not compatible with life. Or the gunshot wound could lead to exsanguination, which is blood loss, which is bleeding to death. And very often this is what happens in gunshot wounds. The person is not killed instantly, but they bleed to death. So that's another mechanism. Or a wound infection. Any infection can reach any wound, and particularly gunshot wounds, and particularly out in the real world. So if someone gets an infection, that infection can spread to the bloodstream, and they would have what we call septic shock and die from that. Again, another mechanism, but the cause was the gunshot wound. One mechanism can have several causes. For example, exsanguination. I talked about bleeding to death. We talked about it happening from a gunshot wound. It can also happen from an ulcer. It can happen from certain medications, blood thinners, heparin, Coumadin, those kinds of things. It can happen from certain diseases. People with hemophilia have a bleeding diathesis or tendency, and they can bleed. So, as you can see, the mechanism and the cause are intimately entwined, but one does not always mesh up with the other. Multiple mechanisms can lead to a particular cause, and multiple causes can lead to a particular mechanism. But let's put that aside right now. Let's talk about the cause of death. The cause of death is what killed the person, and that's the first thing that the medical examiner must determine. Was this a stab wound, a gunshot wound, an overdose, a natural event like a heart attack or a stroke? Why did this person die? And he will use all available information to come to that conclusion. He will take police reports and witness reports. He will do his autopsy. He will do toxicological examination and microscopic examinations. He will do all these things necessary to look at what was the cause of death. Okay, so now let's say he's got the cause of death. His next focus is then the manner of death. And basically, the manner of death looks at why did the person die and by whose hand and for what purpose. Why did the person die and by whose hand and for what purpose? So a natural death is something that happens naturally. Mother Nature takes you out. You have a heart attack, you have a stroke, you have cancer, you have a pneumonia. You have some disease process that ends your life. This happens all the time. It's going to happen to all of us someday. So a natural cause of death are the things that we see in hospitals all the time. An accidental death. This results from unforeseen or unplanned circumstances. Things such as falls and automobile accidents and electrocutions in home. Never work on your electrical system. Things like that, drowning in pools and bathtubs, all these things happen. Suicidal. Well, suicidal is where someone purposefully inflicts harm upon themselves in order to bring about their death. So, by whose hand is by the victim, and for what purpose is to end their life. So, suicidal is another reason. This can be self inflicted gunshot wounds, drug overdoses, self hangings, jumps off tall buildings. Uh, there was one in the news recently where a guy apparently had issues with his wife, so he crashed his plane into their house. Well, that's a dramatic suicide. Homicidal. These are homicides that occur at the hand of another. In other words, it's not an accident, it's not a suicide. Someone wanted this person killed and did it. And homicide, when we see homicide, that definitely brings it into the world of the medical examiner and the police investigative processes. Accidents and suicides might, if it's determined that an accident, especially in an industrial place or on public highways, was this accident a criminal event? Was the person intoxicated or impaired in some way? Suicidal, of course. Uh, Sometimes insurance payments are involved and they will invoke an investigation by the medical examiner. Sometimes the family do not want the cause of death to be suicide and they will plead with the medical examiner or the coroner to change it to something else because of social stigma or whatever. So there's other reasons. But homicidal will definitely enter the world of the medical examiner, the coroner, and the police. And murder is a legal charge that's determined by the courts. It's not determined by the police. But the medical examiner has very strong powers here, and it almost always has the blessing of the courts in whatever he wants to do. And remember, once a medical examiner coroner gets into the picture, he has subpoena power. He has power to look at all the records. Their power is very, very great because for the public good, if someone was murdered, we need to know who, why, when, where, how. Sometimes it's not determined. Sometimes the medical examiner cannot determine which one of these categories it falls into. It's not natural, accidental, suicidal, homicidal. It could be any of those. And so he will mark it out as undetermined or unclassified. And it's kind of an extra category that is a wastebasket, if you will, for all the things that um, he can't determine at that time. Maybe he doesn't have enough information. Maybe the investigation hasn't moved on far enough. How can this happen? Well, an example is a heroin or drug overdose. So let's say this individual is found in an alley, a known drug addict, a known heroin user with a needle in his arm, and he's dead. No question. And at autopsy, he has very high apomorphine levels. They don't test for heroin because it's immediately uh, turned in the bloodstream to a morphine analog, and that's the narcotic that takes you out. But if you overdose on this, you will stop breathing because it depresses the breathing center in the base of the brain, and you will die from asphyxia. And so the cause of death is asphyxia from a heroin or narcotic overdose. But what's the manner of death? Let's say this individual, remember, he's probably not a chemist, and he buys his stuff from Joe and Sam and Bill and whoever on the street. Every packet of heroin he gets is a little different. It's stepped on, as it were, has other things added more or less depending on the supplier, et cetera, et cetera. It's got contaminants, it's got all kinds of stuff. Bottom line is that when he goes back to his little hobby hole, wherever it is, little cubby hole where he injects, the alley or a apartment somewhere, he takes his spoon, he puts a little bit in there, he melts it, he draws it up in the syringe, he shoots it in his veins. He has no idea exactly how much heroin is in that. None, zero. He just takes the same amount of this powder and melts it. It could be 10% heroin, 20% heroin, 80% heroin. He has no way of knowing. And so if he gets a batch that contains twice as much heroin as he's used to taking, and he mixes up his same amount and squirts it in, he could easily die from depression of his breathing center and asphyxia because he's basically taken a double dose or a triple dose or whatever. And so that would be an accidental death. He didn't intend to kill himself. No one did anything to him. He just couldn't figure out his dose. Suicidal. What if this same guy injected this excess amount of heroin because he was tired of living like he was living on the streets, no money, maybe robbing people, doing whatever he can, maybe prostituting, whatever, to feed the habit. And maybe he's finally got to the end of his rope and said, I've had it. I want out of here. Goodbye, cruel world. I'm gone. So he gets his next batch of heroin, which might be enough for him to, shoot up 4, 5, 6 times, whatever. And he takes it all at once. And he overdoses and he dies in the alleyway. Okay? That would be a suicidal death. But what if this guy was considered to be a snitch? What if his dealer felt he might be in collusion with the police, that he might be trying to set him up for a sting operation to get arrested? And, the time you do for that crime can be very large. So he's highly motivated. So what does he do? Normally, he sells this guy a little bag that's about 20% heroin, the rest of it talcum powder and who knows what. But this time he gives him one that's 90% pure. Again, this guy's not a chemist. He just mixes up his usual amount, melts it, draws it up, squirts it, done deal. But he's getting 4 or 5 times his normal dose. So he dies due to depression of his breathing center and asphyxia. That would be a homicidal death. So you have the same cause of death, the same mechanism of death. The cause of death is a heroin overdose. The mechanism is depression of the breathing center and death from asphyxia. But you've got 3 different manners of death. Now, it's not natural. Heroin's not a natural thing, but it can be accidental. It can be suicidal. It can be homicidal, depending upon the investigative circumstances. But initially, and maybe forever, the medical examiner may write it off as undetermined because he doesn't know if it was done by his own hand, the victim's own hand, either accidentally or suicidally, or it was done by the hand of another, which would make it a homicide. So you can see that this is something that the medical examiner has to wrestle with. So he may write it out as undetermined. Another example would be a car versus a pedestrian. Let's say a hit and run driver, he hits the pedestrian and takes off and the pedestrian is killed. All right. Was it an accident? And the guy freaked out and took off? Was alcohol involved? That would obviously bring about criminal charges, but he didn't intend to hit this guy who crossed the street between 2 cars and he hit him with his car and killed him. Doesn't mean that it's not going to end up in a criminal investigation. In fact, leaving the scene would probably lead to that. Was it suicidal? What if the victim, ran out in front of the car because he knew at this intersection or at this road, this place, the guy would be going so fast and it was so dark that he wouldn't see him and it was a suicide? It happens. Or a homicide. What if this guy had information? What if this guy was going to tell about the driver of the car was an embezzler and he knew about it, or he was a child molester, or he was having an affair with his wife? Maybe he had some reason he wanted this guy dead, and so he waits down the street. And he sees this guy getting ready to go to work in the morning. And he's got to cross the street to his car parked across the other way. And here he comes flying down the street. And as soon as the guy steps out, he nails him. That's homicidal. So when they find the guy laying in the street, it all looks the same. Accidental, suicidal, homicidal, it all looks the same. It's when you get into the investigation, which is where your private investigator or your police officer, detective will enter the picture and start digging around, you will determine what the manner of death is. And that's really the story. is why was this person killed and by whose hand? Gunshot wounds, the same way. Was a gunshot wound to somebody's head an accident? Were they cleaning the gun? Were they fooling around with a gun? Were they clowning around with it, trying to spin it on their finger and look like Wyatt Earp and shot themselves in the head? Happens. Was it suicidal? People use guns to commit suicide all the time. Was it homicidal? People use guns to kill other people all the time. So now you have to get the detective in there and the crime scene investigators in there to look at the scene and determine, was this an accident? Does the distance between the muzzle and the entry wound, and this can be determined up to a couple of feet usually, was it close enough to have been done in this manner? Or was it 10 feet away? Maybe. Was it suicidal? What's the angle? Was it a dominant hand that was used? Though that's not always the case. Right-handed people don't always shoot themselves with their right hand, uh, but often they do, and probably more often than not. Was the angle of the entry and exit wounds allow a position that was comfortable or even possible? Was the distance between the muzzle and the entry wound close enough? Was it only inches? Was it a contact wound? Was the muzzle up against the skin, in other words? Uh, or was it far away? Was it more than 2 feet away? And could this person have operated the gun from that distance and shot themselves? Or was it homicidal? Did someone else do it? One of the things they might do in this circumstance is do a psychological autopsy where they will come in and look at this individual's story. They will talk to family and friends and loved ones and all of that and coworkers to see what the state of mind was. No, this person, she was happy. She was just started a new job, was just getting ready to go to night school, was planning this big vacation to Europe. She had no reason. There was no blues in the picture. Or, well, she's been depressed. She's been smoking and drinking more. She's been, taking downers and to go to sleep at night. She just hadn't been herself lately. It just seems sad all the time. Okay, that would favor suicide. But the crime scene really tells a lot. And again, the medical examiner may, at the end of the day, when he looks at all the evidence from the crime scene and the ballistic reports, or actually gunshot analysis reports, he may not be able to determine whether it's accidental, suicidal, or homicidal until your sleuth obviously digs deeper. So the manner of death will determine whether an investigation is even launched or not. Obviously homicidal it will, and as I discussed earlier, sometimes suicidal and sometimes accidental. Natural, usually not, unless there is some supposed medical misadventure, they call it, or a medical malpractice situation. The other thing that is important to point out here is that the manner of death is not fixed. It can change. It can change. In other words, first, it may be written out as undetermined. It may be written out as an accident because everything looks that way. But as investigators dig deeper into the story and start finding relationships and motives and MO, and the weapon was purchased by a sworn enemy, and the person's fingerprints were found at the scene, or their DNA was found at the scene, or their car was seen leaving the scene, and now suddenly you've got another actor involved, that this wasn't accidental or suicidal, that someone actually came in and shot this person. Now the medical examiner can include all this evidence in his determination and change it to mean that it's homicidal. Okay? So it's not fixed in stone. As the investigation moves along and as evidence is uncovered, then it may change categories, particularly from undetermined into one of the others. Also, let's talk about proximate cause and cascade of events. A guy is shot in the head by another guy, and he ends up in the hospital. He doesn't die. He survives, but his brain is severely damaged. He's in a coma and he never wakes up. And so he's left on a ventilator. He's left with that kind of support. They do a tracheotomy. Now he's in a long-term care facility on a ventilator, and he's been there for 3 years. Not going to be a good outcome. Everybody knows that. But he's still on the ventilator because he still has some degree of brain activity. Nobody wants to pull the plug. Everybody wants him to live, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, fine. Then he gets pneumonia, and he gets a severe pneumonia. And pneumonia damages his lungs so much that he finally suffers a cardiac arrest from low oxygen in the blood, and he dies 3 years later. The person who shot him, what's their culpability? Guy died of pneumonia. That's a natural event. It's very common in people who are in comas, who are not moving, and particularly who are on ventilatory support. Pneumonias happen all the time. So he died from a natural event. But the proximate cause was the gunshot wound to the head. It began the cascade of events that led to the death. So without the gunshot wound to the head, without the brain injury, without him being comatose, without him being on a ventilator for all that time, the pneumonia would not have occurred, and therefore the death would not have occurred. So suddenly, the guy who is in jail for an assault, doing a 15-year sentence or whatever, is now charged with murder, homicide, and now another trial begins. And this may have a different result. So it's not fixed in time. It's not fixed in cause and manner. It can change, and it changes as the investigation and the events unfold. So we talked a little bit about cause and manner of death. I said there were three major determinations that the medical examiner had to make: the cause, the manner, and the time of death. And all three are critical. In this episode, we talked about cause and manner because those are critically important as to whether any investigation is going to be launched, and if so, by whom. Next time, we're going to talk about time of death, which is also critically important because it can explode alibis or it can support witness statements. It can do a lot of things. So, and it's a complex issue. So we will talk about that next time. So until then, remember, this is a copyrighted podcast solely owned by the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. So don't steal it. Until next time, I hope you've enjoyed the show. Be chatting with you again soon. Have a great day.